As researchers, we often see research as a very linear process. You design your research, you conduct your research, you have your findings, you write your book or your article, and then you plan your knowledge exchange activities. But what is really important and what makes research so valuable is engaging with communities from the very beginning of the project, because that will ensure that any knowledge exchange activities you do in future are valuable to those communities. To talk about this topic further, I've invited Akushla Young, who's a community engagement specialist with whom I've worked over the last few years, to talk to me about how, as researchers, we can do more inclusive research and knowledge exchange.
We first got involved with each other through interviewing for your book, where I was a menstrual health advocate. And then since then, we've worked together through sort of my networks and connections in the charity sector and in the advocacy and activism networks as well.
One of the reasons I was so keen to work with you is I knew that you really understood the importance of engaging inclusively, respectfully and ethically with various communities. So, one thing that's always been so important to me is to make sure that if I do research that impacts minority groups, to ensure that that research is useful for those groups. And therefore, I'd always want to include them in terms of research design.
One of the things that I often come from is when we're thinking about EDI work, I think the term EDI is quite diluted. And so I tend to think of it as acknowledging your own privilege and dismantling traditional forms of that, and how that can help in the research process. So the first thing to really consider is to make sure that the communities that you're wanting to engage in your research are involved from the very start. So we're talking right at the conception of the idea around what you want to research.
And I know it's so important as well that there are researchers who are from those communities that do that research. I think that's really valuable. But also I think it's really important in terms of knowledge exchange projects that you pay organisations that have access to those communities for those communities and for their networks. And then the KE work is delivered by those communities and community members to members of the community, and that is all paid for as well.
Yes.
Because I know historically there's been a lot of distrust between communities and researchers. Could you tell me a little bit about why?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, first of all, what you said around compensating communities is really important, not just financially, but also if there needs to be sort of emotional compensation as well through counselling and therapy, then that's really important to consider too. If we look historically at the relationship between communities and research institutions, there is a lot of distrust there, because often minority communities have been the victims of abuse in the name of research. And so that kind of the scars of that do not fade through generations. And so that needs to be kind of accounted for, needs to be acknowledged. And when you're working with communities, you need to understand that you are coming from a position of an institution that was once harmful.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so important as well, and this is something I try really hard to practice, to acknowledge the value of lived experience, the value of community knowledge, and not to think that academic knowledge is more valuable. It's a knowledge exchange. It's not a researcher going and just dumping knowledge. And knowledge exchange has to benefit communities.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I think, in my opinion, I think that community knowledge and lived experience is actually even more valuable than academic knowledge, because I don't think you can really have academic knowledge without the lived experience and the community experience. So I think that's kind of even more important and has to be compensated as such.
I know one thing that we both find frustrating is when researchers reach out to one person and think that person is representative of an entire group, when within minority groups there are intersections of faith, of ethnicity, of gender, of disability. So could you tell me a bit more about how to ensure that your research and knowledge exchange is actually intersectional and beneficial for a variety of different people within those communities?
Yeah, definitely. I think something that researchers often fall into the trap of is by selecting, say, one person from a minority community who is kind of an acceptable face, someone who makes them feel comfortable, perhaps speaks their language, uses the same the same kind of language that they use, and makes them feel that, oh, I know how this person's going to speak, I understand what this person's going to say. But actually there are so many intersections within intersections, as you said, that you really need to broaden your horizon in terms of who are you actually engaging within the community. Is it one specific spokesperson who perhaps his voice is always being amplified, and do you want to go beyond that? And I think something to consider for researchers is really thinking about the digital divide between certain communities, because some communities do not have access to the same kind of systems that researchers have access to. And often one of the best ways to engage communities is by physically going there. So rather than sending an email, it's about actually making the effort to go into that community and say, hi, this is who I am, I'd love to learn more about what you're doing, and really putting a face behind what it is you're trying to do.
Absolutely. And then kind of from that community find a partnership to ensure that it's kind of a relationship that's equal.
Exactly. And making sure that the partnership itself as an organisation, whether it might be that, is being compensated, but also the participants within that organisation are also being compensated as well. So another important thing that we need to think about when working with communities is being able to avoid harm and extraction. So a lot of communities feel that sometimes researchers will come into their space, and then often people will have to kind of give over information that is really sensitive and can cause emotional trauma, and then researchers may not come back into that space to empower that community with what they've learnt. And so it's really important that when you're going to a community, you say, this is what we want to do, and this is how we're going to sort of help empower individuals within the community. And I know that you've done a lot of that within your work too.
Yeah, absolutely. That's such an important point, because my research involved teenagers in school talking about menstruation, which is a topic that can be very difficult to talk about, and they were really amazing in terms of how honest they were and how open they were. So obviously I've written those findings in my book, and in my book I've also made recommendations to what schools and organisations can do to support young people. And my book being open access means that anyone, anywhere in the world can read that for free. So that's one thing I've done. But of course academic books are not necessarily that accessible in terms of language. So I've therefore applied for funding to do various knowledge exchange projects to feed back into those communities. So for instance, all of the schools and colleges that were involved in my research, I've invited them to a show called Blood, which I collaborated on with a performer and primary school teacher, Belsky. So I invited schools there. So they actually got to sit and watch a show that was created as a result of that research. And I included quotes from the young people, anonymous, of course, and put them on the screen. And I had volunteers read those out. But also I've sent the guidance that we've done together on how to communicate effectively about menstruation to the schools, to the colleges. And also one way I was very keen to feedback was, it was a recurrent theme in my research that the young people wish they'd learned more about periods at primary school. So based on their suggestions, I worked with Belsky to create a menstrual health education curriculum, and we taught that in her primary school to about 120 8 to 11-year-olds. So knowledge from communities of young people, and it was a very diverse group of young people that I spoke to, has now gone back to help other young people. And they've heard about the findings of the research too.
The thing with dissemination is what you need to consider is how you're going to put that into your funding proposals as well.
Absolutely.
So I think that sometimes what's considered within funding proposals is, what book could I write? What journal article could I write? But actually it's what community event could you do to bring back your participants and share what you've learned and empower that community further and give back, so you can avoid that extraction, you can avoid that harm. And it needs to be thought about in an accessible way.
And perhaps that could include budgeting for translations, for example.
Exactly.
I know in the project we are working on now, that's one thing that we've done, is included a budget for Urdu and Hindi and Punjabi.
Absolutely. And also thinking about transport as well, for disabled communities, because it's all fine and well to say we're having an event at the university, but how are certain communities supposed to access that? So it's really important to think about access in so many different ways, whether that be visual access or through language or physical access through disability as well.
Absolutely. And to ensure as well that communities are compensated for that space and the use of their spaces. And if anyone within the community is running an event linked to your research, that they're paid not only for organising the event, but also for the planning of the event and any training they have to do as well.
Absolutely. And I think really for an authentic collaboration as well, you should continue to support that organisation and that community, whether that be through your professional or personal life, because that can also feel extractive. If you're just going to that community for the purpose of essentially wanting data for your own research and then never going back after that project, that can also kind of give feelings of mistrust and feelings of being used. So it's really important to say, if you want to research a certain community, then invest in that community.
And as well, the value of having people from that community do the research as well. And that goes back to ensuring we have a more diverse group of people working in research, working in academia. And to do that, we just have to tackle the structural inequalities that are in society. And if you could give one top tip to researchers on how to conduct research in KE ethically, what would it be?
It would really be to involve the communities that you're wanting to include in your research from the very beginning. I think the biggest kind of pitfall is you send in your funding application and you get your funding without having consulted properly with the communities that you're working with. Because by that point, you as the researcher can think, I've got a great idea and I'm going to, go and do this. It's going to be so helpful. And then you get into a community and then they say, actually, this is really not what we need. This is not helpful at all. In fact, it's harmful. And then you're kind of stuck. So it's involving them from the very beginning and making sure you're writing in compensation into everything that you do.
Yeah. And that is one of the many reasons that I am still working with you into our next project, because that's the kind of point we're going to be starting from.